In 1971, I helped found an environmental group in the basement of a Unitarian church in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years later, it had grown into an international powerhouse. We were making headlines every month. I was famous, and then I walked out the door. The mission, once noble, had become corrupted. Political agendas and fear-mongering trumped science and truth. Here's how it happened. When I was studying for my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, I joined a small activist group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. It was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. I became radicalized by these realities and by the emerging consciousness of the environment. The mission of the Don't Make a Wave Committee was to launch an ocean-going campaign against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, a symbol of our opposition to nuclear war. As one of our early meetings was breaking up, someone said, "Peace." A reply came, "Why don't we make it a green peace?" And a new movement was born. Green was for the environment, and peace was for the people. We named our boat the Greenpeace, and I joined the 12-person crew for a voyage of protest. We didn't stop that H-bomb test, but it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. We had won a major victory. In 1975, Greenpeace took a sharp turn away from our anti-nuclear efforts and set out to save the whales, sailing the high seas to confront Russian and Japanese whalers. The footage we shot, young protesters positioned between harpoons and fleeing whales, was shown on TV around the world. Public donations poured in. By the early 1980s, we were campaigning against toxic waste, air pollution, trophy hunting, and the live capture of orca whales. But I began to feel uncomfortable with the course my fellow directors were taking. I found myself the only one of 6 international directors with a formal science background. We were now tackling subjects that involved complex issues of toxicology, chemistry, and human health. You don't need a PhD in marine biology to know it's a good thing to save whales from extinction. But when you're analyzing which chemicals to ban, you need to know some science. And the first lesson of ecology is that we are all interconnected. Humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Many other species, disease agents and their carriers, for example, are our enemies, and we have the moral obligation to protect human beings from these enemies. Biodiversity is not always our friend. I had noticed something else. As we grew into an international organization with over 100 million a year coming in, a big change in attitude had occurred. The peace in Greenpeace had faded away. Only the green part seemed to matter now. Humans, to use Greenpeace language, had become the enemies of the earth. Putting an end to industrial growth and banning many useful technologies and chemicals became common themes of the movement. Science and logic no longer held sway. Sensationalism, misinformation, and fear were what we used to promote our campaigns. The final straw came when my fellow directors decided that we had to work to ban the element chlorine worldwide. They named chlorine the devil's element, as if it were evil. But this was absurd. Adding chlorine to drinking water was one of the biggest advances in the history of public health. And anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry knew that many of our most effective pharmaceuticals had a chlorine component. Not only that, but if this anti-chlorine campaign succeeded, it wouldn't be our wealthy donors who would suffer. Wealthy individuals and countries always find a way around these follies. The ones who suffer are those in developing countries, people we're presumably trying to help. For example, Greenpeace has opposed the adoption of golden rice, a genetically modified variety of rice that contains beta-carotene. Golden rice has the potential to prevent the death of 2 million of the world's poorest children every year. But that doesn't matter to the Greenpeace crowd. GMOs are bad, so golden rice must be bad. Apparently millions of children dying isn't. This kind of rigid, backward thinking is usually attributed to the unenlightened and the anti-scientific. But I've discovered from the inside out that it can infect any organization, even those with names as noble-sounding as Greenpeace. I'm Patrick Moore for Prager University. What are two of the dirtiest words in the English language? Well, if you're concerned with global warming, as so many people are these days, the answer is obvious. The two words are carbon dioxide, or as it is known by its chemical symbol, CO2. One atom of carbon and two atoms of oxygen. If we pump much more of it into the atmosphere, the argument goes, we're going to alter the climate, catastrophically. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, which constitute 85% of our energy use, must be reduced to zero by 2100. If we don't save ourselves from ourselves, we're toast. That's the claim. Here's what's strange, though. All life is carbon-based, and the carbon for all that life originates from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All of the carbon in the fossil fuels we are burning for energy today was once in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide before it was consumed by plankton in the sea and plants on the land. Coal, oil, and natural gas are the remains of those plankton and plants that have been transformed by heat and pressure deep in the Earth's crust. In other words, fossil fuels are 100% organic and were produced with solar energy. Sounds positively green. If there were no carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, the Earth would be a dead planet, period. Talk about catastrophic climate change. Take away CO2 and you'd have it. And yet the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has deemed this essential ingredient for life a pollutant. But how can something that makes life possible be bad? Before I deal with that question, let's get clear on our terms. It has become common to refer to the emissions from burning fossil fuels for energy as carbon emissions. That is entirely misleading. Carbon dioxide is not carbon. Carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas which is an indispensable food for all living things. Can you have too much of it? In theory, yes. That's what climate alarmists say is happening now. CO2 levels are getting too high. Are they right? Well, if we look at the big picture, we find something surprising. For most of the history of life on Earth, carbon dioxide has been present in the atmosphere at much higher levels than it is today. During the Cambrian explosion, when multicellular life first came on the scene, CO2 levels were as much as 10 times higher than they are today. From a big picture perspective, we're actually living in a low carbon dioxide era. The optimum level of CO2 for plant growth, for example, is 4 to 5 times what is currently found in our atmosphere. That's why greenhouse growers worldwide actually inject additional CO2 into their greenhouses. They want to promote plant growth. Likewise, higher CO2 levels in the global atmosphere will boost food and forest productivity. That will come in handy, since by mid-century, we will have to feed 8 to 10 billion people. In fact, we're already seeing the positive effects of increased carbon dioxide now. Satellite measurements have noted the greening of the Earth as crops and forests grow due to our higher levels of CO2. It turns out that carbon dioxide are not dirty words after all. We should celebrate CO2 as the giver of life that it is. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University. For all future stewards of the earth, and that's all of us, here's a quick quiz. What is the most renewable and sustainable material with which to build our homes? How can we turn some of the CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere into an asset? And how can we make the world more beautiful and green? The answer to all these questions is trees. Trees make up about 90% of all the living biomass on Earth, and forests serve as home to the majority of species on the planet. We use thousands of products, many every day, that come from trees. Some are obvious, like wood and paper, and many not so obvious, like microcrystalline cellulose, a key ingredient in many medicines. Anyway, who doesn't love trees? Yet trees, especially in the last few decades, have become very controversial. People are divided into two broad camps. One group sees trees as a critical source of renewable material and of renewable energy. This group generally favors planting trees and making use of the many products derived from them. The other group emphasizes the value of forests as ecosystems to provide a protected habitat for threatened species. This group prefers to see forests off limits to commercial use. The arguments between these two groups can get pretty heated. But here's the good news. If we do it right, we can use our trees and enjoy them too. Before I explain how, I need to define two terms. The first is forestry, which means the creation, management, and use of forests. The second term is deforestation, which means the permanent loss of forests. There are two widespread misconceptions about forestry. The first misconception is that forestry, as practiced by the forest industry, is responsible for deforestation. We may think that when we buy wood from a lumber yard, we are causing a bit of forest to be lost somewhere. But what we're really doing is sending a signal to the marketplace to plant more trees, to produce more wood, to supply the demand in the lumber yard. It is no different from any other renewable crop. It's just that trees take longer to mature than annual farm crops. The giant paper company Boise Cascade is just as much in the business of planting trees as it is in harvesting them. The key point is it's not the harvesting of trees that causes deforestation. Deforestation is the result of harvesting and then not replanting a forest or not letting it grow back naturally, which it would do if just left alone. Deforestation sounds like a bad word, and it can be, but usually it's not. All it means is that after the trees are harvested, the land is used for a different purpose. The largest cause of deforestation is agriculture, the creation of new farmland. But farming is important. After all, the world has 7 billion people to feed. Another reason for deforestation is to make way for towns and cities. Manhattan was once a great forest. Now it's a great city. The second misconception about forestry is the tendency to judge landscapes by how they look to our eyes. We easily make the mistake of using our sense of what is beautiful and what is unsightly to judge the ecology of the land. This results in repulsion at the sight of a recently logged landscape because it looks ravaged, destroyed, and unsightly. We don't react this way to a landscape of pasture with sheep peacefully grazing, or a wheat field waving in the wind, yet both are examples of deforestation. Where there once was a biodiverse natural forest, we now have a ranch or a farm. In other words, we judge the book by the cover and equate beauty with ecological health and unsightliness with destruction of nature. These impressions have led many environmentalists to support cutting fewer trees, as if our forests are disappearing. But they're not. There is the same area of forest in the US and Canada today as there was 100 years ago. If anything, it's growing. This despite the fact that the population has tripled. But the professional environmentalists are never satisfied. They behave as if every tree should be protected, and that the products they yield are unnecessary. This is badly misguided. The correct position, from a purely environmental perspective, is to grow more trees, the world's most abundant renewable resource, and use more wood. We can do both. In the end, we're all tree huggers. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University. The only constant is change. That's true about life, and it's true about the climate. The climate has been constantly changing since the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. For example, in just the past 2,000 years, we have seen the Roman warm period, when it was warmer than today. Then came the cooler Dark Ages, followed by the medieval warm period, when it was at least as warm as today. Then we had the Little Ice Age that drove the Vikings out of Greenland, and most recently, a gradual 300-year warming to the present day. That's a lot of changes, and of course, not one of them was caused by humans. During the past 400,000 years, there have been 4 major periods of glaciation, meaning that vast sheets of ice covered a good part of the globe, interrupted by brief interglacial periods. We are in one of those periods right now. This is all part of the Pleistocene Ice Age, which began in earnest 2.5 million years ago. It's still going on, which means that we are still living in an ice age. That's the reason there's so much ice at the poles. 30 million years ago, the Earth had no ice on it at all. So then what about carbon dioxide, the great villain of the global warming alarmists? Where does that fit into this picture? Not as neatly as you might think. Temperatures and carbon dioxide levels do not show a strong correlation. In fact, over very long time spans, periods of hundreds of millions of years, they are often completely out of sync with one another. Over and over again, within virtually any time frame, we find the climate changing, for reasons we do not fully understand. But we do know there are many more factors in play than simply the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Factors such as the shape and size of the Earth's elliptical orbit around the Sun, activity from the Sun, and the amount of wobble or tilt in the Earth's axis, among many others. Even the relatively short 300-year period from the peak of the Little Ice Age to the present has not been steady. The latest trend has been a warming one, but it began nearly a century before there were significant carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. And there has been no significant warming trend in the 21st century. Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat. Meanwhile, human-caused CO2 emissions are higher than ever. About 25% of all the CO2 emissions from human sources have occurred during this period of no net warming. So what are we in for next? Will the temperature resume an upward trend? Will it remain flat for a lengthy period? Or will it begin to drop? No one knows, not even the biggest, fastest computers. All the information I've presented, the increases, decreases, and plateaus in temperature over the ages and into the last centuries, is available to anyone who wants to seek it out. Yet to state these simple facts is to risk being called a climate change denier. Not only is that absurd, it's mean-spirited. It's absurd because no one, not even the most fervent skeptic, denies that the climate is changing. And it's mean-spirited because to call someone a climate change denier is to intentionally link them to people who deny the Holocaust. So maybe it's time to stop the name-calling. Predicting the climate, one of the most complex systems on Earth, with thousands of inputs, many of which we don't understand, isn't an exact science or anything close to it. Maybe it's just a tad arrogant to suggest that we can predict the weather or the climate or just about anything 60 years from now. The science is not settled. The debate is not over. The climate is always changing, it always has, and it always will. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University. We are all genetically modified organisms, all 7 billion of us, and every other creature on Earth produced by sexual reproduction. I point this out because genetically modified has become a loaded term that is misused to describe recombinant DNA biotechnology, one of the most important technological advances in the 10,000-year history of agriculture. Throw in bogus, Hollywood-inspired terms like Frankenfoods, killer tomatoes, and Terminator seeds, and you have the makings of one of the most groundless anti-science campaigns in the history of anti-science campaigns. We have been modifying the genetics of plants and animals since agriculture and the domestication of animals began. The anti-GMO activists counter. Nature never moves DNA from one species to another, therefore GMOs are unnatural. Not so. Genes have been moving across species boundaries since life began. Bacteria routinely carry fragments of DNA from one species to another, and that DNA is sometimes incorporated into the genes of the host species. This random movement of genetic material has been one of the driving forces in the development of species. The human genome, for example, has 70% of its genes in common with the sea urchin. Why wouldn't we harness this naturally occurring phenomenon to improve the makeup of our food and fiber crops? Today, 18 million farmers in 28 countries are growing genetically modified crops on 448 million acres, 12% of the world's farmland, or about the same area as all U.S. cropland. It would be at least 3 times that if not for bans and restrictions in many countries. Bans and restrictions that are irrational, anti-science, and terribly harmful to the world's poor. Every credible science, health, and nutrition organization in the world says the genetically modified food available today is safe, without reservation. This includes the World Health Organization, the European Commission, and the Society for Toxicology. How many people know, for example, that the durum wheat used to make most of our pasta had its DNA modified by exposing seeds to high-level gamma radiation, and there is no labeling required? But what about those supposedly evil seed companies like Monsanto? Aren't they trying to control the world's food supply? First, let's remember, these companies are not weapons manufacturers or drug cartels. They're trying to make better seeds for agriculture. Second, the seed companies don't decide which seeds to plant. Farmers make that decision. The fact is, these companies have done massive good. Millions of people have nutritious food to eat thanks to their innovative work that has also reduced the use of pesticides. Recently, the first comprehensive study of genetically modified crop performance reported some surprising numbers. On average, GM crops increased yield by 22%, reduced pesticide use 37%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. In addition, new varieties of GM crops offer nutritional benefits that are not present in the conventional varieties of crops. The best known of these is golden rice, a GM rice variety that, unlike conventional rice, has beta-carotene in the grain. The human body converts beta-carotene into vitamin A. Without enough vitamin A, children go blind, and many die, about 2 million every year in poor countries of Africa and Asia. In fact, lack of vitamin A is the biggest killer of children in the world today. Invented 15 years ago, golden rice alone has the potential to end all vitamin A deficiency. Yet the anti-GMO movement is vehemently opposed to it just because it's a GMO. As a result, no country has approved golden rice for commercial farming. So while children continue to go blind and die, the anti-GMO crowd celebrates a victory. And we're supposed to be angry at Monsanto? It's time to put an end to the debate over the safety of genetically modified crops and foods. Today, nearly all of our beer, wine, cheese, and yogurt are made with GM yeast and culture. Most of our livestock are fed genetically modified corn and soybeans, and most of our prepared foods contain GM ingredients. Here's a simple solution. People who want to believe there's something sinister or unhealthy about GM plants should either buy food that is labeled non-GM or pay more for so-called organic food. The rest of us, the ones who embrace science, can get on with healthy and productive lives. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University.